$888, the CEO said with a dismissive smile. That tiny repair can wait. 10 minutes later, the engines of her multi-million-dollar jet refused to come alive, and for the first time in years, money stood helpless on a silent runway. The late afternoon sun poured across the private aviation terminal outside Dallas, painting polished fuselages in shades of gold, while the steady hum of fuel trucks and distant turbine whines blended into the familiar rhythm of another busy day. Mechanics crossed the ramp with tool carts. Pilots reviewed checklists beneath the wings of sleek business aircraft, and travelers hurried between luxury SUVs and waiting cabins without ever noticing the men who kept every flight safe. Caleb Turner noticed everything. At 32, he had learned that airplanes always whispered before they screamed, and that the smallest overlooked detail often carried the greatest consequence. Wearing faded work boots, navy coveralls marked with years of honest labor, and a name patch stitched simply with Turner, he crouched beneath the nose section of a silver executive jet while sunlight reflected softly from the polished aluminum around him. His hands moved carefully across a pressure regulation assembly before he paused, narrowed his eyes, and quietly exhaled. There it is, he murmured to himself. The worn valve showed only the faintest sign of failure, something most technicians might have ignored for another flight or two. But Caleb had built his reputation on never gambling with someone else's life. He removed a small inspection light from his pocket, confirmed the flaw, then wrote a neat estimate on a service form. $888. Not $800. Not $900. Exactly what the replacement required. No hidden charges. No unnecessary labor. Just the truth. A pair of expensive heels clicked across the concrete behind him. Is there a problem? The voice was calm, confident, accustomed to immediate answers. Caleb stood slowly and turned toward the owner of the aircraft. Madeline Hayes looked every bit the executive whose schedule moved faster than the plane she owned. Her tailored ivory blazer remained perfectly pressed despite the Texas heat. Her blonde hair rested neatly over one shoulder, and every movement suggested someone who had spent years making decisions measured in millions of dollars. Caleb handed her the estimate without ceremony. This pressure regulator needs to be replaced before departure. Total cost is $888. She glanced at the paper for less than 2 seconds before letting out a quiet laugh. For a valve? She asked. That's your recommendation? Caleb replied evenly. It's what I would do if this were my own aircraft. She folded the estimate once and handed it back. It isn't your aircraft. Around them, a few ground crew members exchanged uncertain glances before quickly returning to work. Caleb never raised his voice. No, ma'am, he answered. But safety belongs to everyone. Madeline smiled politely, though the warmth never reached her eyes. I have an entire maintenance team in Chicago waiting for this jet tonight. I'm not delaying an international meeting over an $888 repair. Caleb simply nodded. That's your decision. There was no argument. No lecture. No wounded pride. He stepped aside, gathered his tools, and quietly walked away while another technician prepared the aircraft for departure. Behind him, the cabin door closed, the ground crew disconnected external power, and the lead pilot climbed into the cockpit. Seconds later, the first engine start sequence began. The starter engaged. The turbines tried to awaken. Then everything stopped. Silence settled across the ramp so suddenly that even the distant gulls circling above seemed louder than the motionless jet. The silence lasted only a few seconds before the cockpit window slid open and the captain leaned out with a puzzled expression. He tried the sequence again, carefully following every checklist item, but the aircraft answered with the same stubborn refusal. Ground power remained steady. Fuel pressure appeared normal. Every display that should have welcomed the engines to life instead displayed a warning that none of the pilots had expected to see. A maintenance supervisor hurried across the ramp carrying a diagnostic tablet, while 2 additional technicians rolled specialized equipment toward the nose of the aircraft. Madeline stood with folded arms, watching the growing activity around her jet with visible impatience. She glanced at her watch, then at her assistant, who was already making nervous phone calls about a meeting in Seattle that had been planned for months. Every passing minute meant executives waiting, investors asking questions, and opportunities slipping farther away. Across the apron, Caleb had already returned to another hangar where an aging single-engine airplane sat quietly beneath bright overhead lights. Its owner, a retired crop pilot named Walter Benson, smiled as Caleb inspected a weathered landing light housing. Walter reached for his wallet. Caleb gently shook his head. This one is only a loose connection. It took 5 minutes. Save your money for fuel. Walter laughed softly. You are going to make a terrible businessman one of these days. Caleb smiled without looking up from his wrench. Maybe, but I sleep well every night. That answer was not unusual for the people who knew him. During 12 years at Lone Star Executive Aviation, Caleb had earned an unusual reputation. He never invented repairs. He never exaggerated problems. If a customer needed a $10 washer, he charged for a $10 washer. If an airplane needed a complete overhaul, he said so without fear of losing the job. Some clients appreciated that honesty. Others mistook it for stubbornness. Caleb never argued with either group. He simply let his work speak louder than his opinions. His phone vibrated inside his pocket. The screen displayed a photograph of a smiling little girl with freckles and bright blue eyes hugging a golden retriever almost twice her size. He answered immediately. Hey, Rosie. Daddy, did you remember tonight is spaghetti night? Her cheerful voice asked. Caleb smiled as he tightened the last bolt on Walter's airplane. I did. The sauce is already thawing in the refrigerator. And the garlic bread? Already waiting. She giggled. You never forget. Some things are too important to forget. Miss Harper says I drew the best airplane in class today. I cannot wait to see it. Will you be home before sunset? Caleb looked toward the large hangar doors where the orange Texas sky stretched across the horizon. That is still the plan. Love you, Daddy. Love you more, Rosie. He slipped the phone back into his pocket just as hurried footsteps echoed across the polished concrete floor. One of the younger mechanics appeared slightly out of breath. Caleb, he called. They have checked everything twice. The jet still will not start. Caleb quietly wiped his hands with a clean shop towel before placing every tool back into its proper place inside the toolbox. He did not hurry. He did not smile. He simply closed the lid with a soft click. Then he looked toward the distant executive terminal where an expensive aircraft sat perfectly still beneath the fading sunlight, surrounded by people who were finally beginning to understand that sometimes the smallest repair carried the greatest value. Caleb walked back across the ramp with the same steady pace he used when carrying a toolbox or a cup of coffee. He did not rush toward the crowd gathering around the silent aircraft because experience had taught him that panic rarely solved mechanical problems. As he approached, one of the company technicians looked up with visible frustration. We checked the batteries, the starter system, the electronic controls, and every primary sensor. Everything says it should start. Caleb nodded once. Sometimes the airplane tells the truth before the computers do. Madeline overheard the remark and folded her arms. So now you are saying our equipment is wrong? Caleb answered without the slightest hint of pride. No, ma'am. I am saying machines do not care how expensive they are. They only respond to what is happening inside them. The lead pilot stepped down from the cockpit and looked directly at Caleb. Would you take one more look? Before Madeline could answer, the pilot quietly added, We are out of options. The words settled over the group like evening dew. Caleb climbed the maintenance ladder and paused beside the open access panel. He did not immediately touch anything. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, listening to the faint ticking sounds of cooling metal beneath the polished skin of the aircraft. Then he reached into his pocket and removed a small folded notebook with weathered pages. Every airplane he had inspected during the past decade had left a few handwritten observations inside that notebook. Dates, temperatures, unusual vibrations, tiny details most people considered unimportant. He turned several pages before stopping at an entry made almost 6 years earlier. His eyes lingered there for only a second. A quiet expression crossed his face, almost like recognizing an old friend. Without another word, he inspected the same pressure assembly he had pointed out earlier. The valve had now failed completely. There, he said softly. The regulator locked under load exactly the way I expected. One mechanic stared at him. How could you possibly know that? Caleb simply handed him the notebook without answering. The younger mechanic looked down at the faded handwriting and frowned. Wait, this tail number. He looked back toward the aircraft registration painted near the rear fuselage. His eyes widened. This is the same jet. Caleb gently took the notebook back before anyone else could read another page. Airplanes remember, he said quietly. So do mechanics. Madeline watched him more carefully than before. For the first time since arriving at the airport, curiosity replaced confidence. You have worked on my aircraft before? Caleb looked at the polished wing reflecting the orange sunset. A long time ago. Why do I not remember you? He offered a polite smile. Because I was never the person people remembered. She opened her mouth to ask another question, but her assistant interrupted, whispering urgently that investors were already waiting on a video conference. Madeline nodded distractedly, though her attention remained fixed on the mechanic standing beside the engine. As Caleb carefully removed the damaged regulator, something slipped from between two maintenance panels and landed softly on the wing walkway. It was an old silver challenge coin, worn smooth around the edges and engraved with the outline of a soaring falcon. Caleb froze for the briefest moment before quietly picking it up and sliding it into his pocket without a word. No one noticed except the elderly line attendant refueling another aircraft nearby. He stared for a long moment, recognition slowly appearing in his eyes, but he said nothing. Far above them, the evening sky darkened into deep blue, while somewhere beyond the hangars, Rosie finished another drawing of an airplane she had never seen, unknowingly sketching the very same falcon engraved on the forgotten coin. The replacement regulator arrived from the maintenance inventory within minutes, still sealed inside its protective packaging. Caleb inspected the part carefully before opening it, checking the serial number twice and comparing it with the aircraft records. Every movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though he believed precision was a form of respect rather than merely a professional habit. Around him, conversations grew quieter. Even the mechanics who had questioned his judgment earlier now stood back and watched without interruption. Madeline remained near the foot of the maintenance stand, her phone resting silently in her hand while unanswered messages continued to illuminate the screen. The meeting she had spent 6 months arranging was slipping away 1 minute at a time, yet for reasons she could not explain, she no longer felt angry at the mechanic. Instead, she found herself wondering how someone who spoke so little could carry such quiet certainty. Caleb finished installing the new regulator and signaled to the cockpit. Run the sequence again, but do not rush it. The captain acknowledged with a nod. Electrical power flowed through the aircraft once more. Switches clicked into position. The familiar startup procedure echoed across the ramp. Everyone waited. The starter engaged smoothly. The turbines began to rotate. A deep, steady whine gradually built into the confident sound every pilot hoped to hear. Seconds later, both engines settled into a stable idle, their rhythm smooth, and even beneath the fading Texas sky, relief spread across the faces of the crew. One technician quietly released a breath he had apparently been holding for several minutes. Another shook his head with a smile of disbelief. The captain climbed down from the cockpit, walked directly to Caleb, and extended his hand. Thank you. You probably saved us from a very difficult night. Caleb accepted the handshake with a modest smile. The airplane did the honest part. I only listened. Madeline stepped closer, studying him with an expression completely different from the one she had worn earlier that afternoon. You were right, she admitted softly. I should have trusted your recommendation. Caleb simply folded the completed maintenance paperwork and handed her the final invoice. The amount had not changed. $888. Nothing more had been added for the emergency call, the overtime, or the delay. Madeline looked from the invoice to his calm face. You could charge much more now. Caleb shook his head. The repair never changed. Neither should the price. She stared at him for a long moment before quietly signing the authorization. For the first time in years, she realized she had spent an entire career negotiating numbers while standing in front of a man whose values could not be negotiated at all. As the crew prepared the aircraft for departure, the elderly line attendant who had noticed the silver challenge coin slowly approached Caleb. His weathered eyes rested on the mechanic with growing curiosity. I thought I recognized that coin, he said in a voice barely above a whisper. Caleb looked at him, but did not answer immediately. The older man smiled gently. Not many people still carry one of those. Caleb slipped the coin deeper into his pocket. Not many people remember where it came from. The attendant nodded as though he understood far more than he revealed. Some stories wait a long time before they are told. Caleb offered only a quiet smile before closing his toolbox. Behind them, the jet rolled slowly toward the taxiway, its engines humming with renewed confidence. While neither Madeline nor anyone else on the ramp realized that the forgotten coin and the faded notebook belonged to the same chapter of Caleb's life, a chapter that had quietly crossed paths with her world years before either of them knew the other's name. The jet disappeared into the evening sky, its navigation lights becoming tiny stars against the darkening horizon, while Caleb watched for only a brief moment before turning back toward the hangar. To everyone else, another aircraft had simply departed. To him, it was another day of doing the job correctly and going home to the little girl waiting for spaghetti and garlic bread. He locked the maintenance cabinet, signed the final service log, and wished the night crew a quiet shift before driving his weathered pickup through the airport gate. By the time he reached his small house on the edge of town, the porch light was already glowing. The front door swung open before he even reached the steps. Rosie ran outside carrying a drawing almost as wide as her smile. "Daddy, you made it before sunset." Caleb knelt to hug her tightly. "I promised, did not I?" She nodded proudly and unfolded the picture. It showed a silver airplane soaring through bright blue skies, but what caught Caleb's attention was the small falcon carefully drawn near the tail. His smile faded for only the briefest second before returning. "That is beautiful." Rosie tilted her head. "I dreamed about that bird again last night." Caleb looked at the drawing quietly. "Did you? It keeps showing me airplanes." He gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "Maybe it just likes flying." Inside the cozy kitchen, the smell of tomato sauce and toasted garlic filled the air while soft country music played from an old radio on the counter. Their home was simple but warm, with family photographs covering one wall and handmade school projects decorating another. After dinner, Rosie disappeared into her room to finish homework while Caleb washed dishes beneath the yellow kitchen light. His phone suddenly vibrated. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar corporate number. He almost ignored it before answering. "This is Caleb Turner." A calm female voice responded. "Mr. Turner, this is Elaine Foster, Chief Legal Counsel for Hayes Aerospace. Miss Hayes would like to invite you to our headquarters tomorrow morning." Caleb dried his hands with a dish towel. "Is there another maintenance issue?" "No, sir." A brief pause followed. "She would like to thank you personally." Caleb glanced toward Rosie's bedroom, where soft humming drifted into the hallway. "I appreciate the invitation, but I have work tomorrow." Elaine hesitated. "She is prepared to compensate you for your time." Caleb smiled faintly. "Respectfully, I already received payment for my work." Before the attorney could answer, he added gently, "Please tell Miss Hayes that the airplane was payment enough." He ended the call politely and returned to drying the last plate. Hundreds of miles away, aboard the aircraft now cruising smoothly above the clouds, Madeline sat alone in the quiet cabin instead of reviewing contracts. The maintenance invoice rested on the table beside her untouched dinner. $888. She read the handwritten signature again. Caleb Turner. Something about the name refused to leave her thoughts. Across the aisle, the captain approached carrying a thick aircraft logbook. "There is something you should probably see," he said. He opened to an older maintenance record dated almost 6 years earlier. The lead mechanic's signature had faded slightly with time, but the name remained perfectly readable. Caleb Turner. Madeline stared silently at the page. "He really did work on this airplane before." The captain nodded. "And according to these notes, he recommended a complete inspection after a lightning strike. The previous ownership declined." Madeline slowly closed the logbook as the realization settled quietly inside her. The airplane she proudly called hers had been protected for years by a man she had never bothered to notice, and somewhere deep within that forgotten inspection report rested a truth that neither of them yet understood would change far more than a single flight. The next morning arrived beneath a clear Texas sky washed in pale blue and gold. Caleb unlocked the maintenance hangar before sunrise, just as he had done nearly every weekday for years. The scent of machine oil, fresh coffee, and cool morning air drifted through the open doors while the first rays of sunlight stretched across polished concrete floors. Airplanes rested quietly inside their bays like sleeping giants waiting for another day of faithful service. Caleb preferred these early hours because engines had not yet begun to roar and the world still felt honest. He poured a cup of black coffee, reviewed the day's inspection schedule, and quietly placed Rosie's newest airplane drawing inside his locker, where every picture she had ever made was carefully preserved. Before he reached for his first toolbox, a sleek black sedan rolled to a gentle stop outside the hangar. Madeline stepped out without an assistant, without security, and without the polished confidence that usually announced her arrival. She wore simple navy slacks and a light sweater instead of an executive suit, almost as though she wanted the morning to belong to someone else rather than the chief executive everyone expected her to be. Caleb looked up briefly and offered the same polite smile he gave every customer. "Good morning." She hesitated before answering. "Good morning." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The distant sound of another aircraft taxiing across the runway filled the silence. Finally, Madeline held out a sealed envelope. "There is a check inside." Caleb did not reach for it. "For what?" "For yesterday." Yesterday was already paid. "Not enough." Caleb shook his head gently. The invoice was correct. She looked almost frustrated. "You prevented a disaster. You protected everyone on board. You could have charged whatever you wanted." He smiled with quiet patience. "If I change the price after discovering someone needs me, then I stop fixing airplanes and start selling fear." The words settled between them with unexpected weight. Madeline slowly lowered the envelope. No boardroom presentation or negotiation seminar had ever explained integrity so simply. She looked around the hangar and noticed something she had missed before. Every tool hung in perfect order. Every maintenance record was handwritten before being entered into the computer. Even the oldest workbench had been polished smooth through years of careful use. Nothing expensive, nothing impressive, just respect for every small responsibility. Her eyes wandered toward the corner of the room where dozens of children's drawings covered a bulletin board. Most showed smiling airplanes beneath bright sunshine. One drawing immediately caught her attention. It was the same silver falcon Rosie had drawn the night before. "Your daughter likes that bird," she said softly. Caleb glanced toward the picture. "She has never seen the real one." "Real one?" Caleb paused for only a heartbeat before answering. "Just an old symbol from another time." He changed the subject with quiet ease. "Would you like some coffee?" Madeline accepted the paper cup he offered, surprised that someone who had refused thousands of dollars could still think to offer something so ordinary. As they stood beside the open hangar door, watching the morning traffic begin to move across the airfield, the elderly line attendant from the previous evening walked slowly past, pushing a fuel cart. He tipped his cap toward Caleb before looking at Madeline. "Miss Hayes," he said kindly, "if you ever want to know why this man cares more about airplanes than money, ask him where he was on October 17th, 6 years ago." Caleb quietly lowered his eyes without saying a word. The old attendant continued walking, leaving only the faint squeak of cart wheels echoing across the concrete, while Madeline looked at Caleb with growing curiosity, unaware that the forgotten date would soon uncover a story connecting both of their lives long before either of them had ever met. Edit. Madeline could not stop thinking about the date the elderly attendant had mentioned. October 17th, 6 years ago, echoed in her mind long after she left the hangar. Instead of driving to headquarters, she instructed her assistant to cancel every morning meeting. "I need the oldest maintenance archives for our Gulfstream," she said. "Everything before my company acquired it." Her assistant looked surprised. "Those records are stored off-site." "Then bring them here." 2 hours later, several weathered binders rested across the conference table in her office. Dust lingered on their covers, untouched for years. Madeline slowly turned page after page filled with inspection reports, engineering notes, handwritten observations, and signatures from mechanics whose names meant nothing to her. Then she found it. October 17th. 6 years earlier. The aircraft had been owned by another corporation before changing hands during a merger. A lightning strike had forced an emergency landing after severe weather crossed northern Texas. Caleb Turner's signature appeared across 4 separate inspection reports. Unlike every other technician, he had added nearly 3 full pages of handwritten recommendations explaining that microscopic structural damage could remain hidden inside the pressure system long after the visible repairs were completed. His recommendation ended with one simple sentence: "Passenger safety should always outweigh operating cost." Beneath that statement, another signature appeared in bold ink: "Repair deferred by ownership." Madeline slowly leaned back in her chair. Someone had ignored him. She continued reading until another attachment slipped from inside the binder and floated gently onto the table. It was a faded newspaper clipping. The headline described an emergency landing during a violent storm that had safely brought every passenger home. The article praised the flight crew, but near the bottom, almost hidden among the text, one paragraph mentioned an overnight mechanic who had insisted on a complete inspection before releasing the aircraft. His name was Caleb Turner. No photograph, no interview, just a single sentence. She closed her eyes for a moment. Once again, he had done the right thing without asking anyone to notice. That afternoon, unable to satisfy her growing curiosity, Madeline returned to the airport. Caleb was outside the hangar kneeling beside a small training airplane, while a teenage aviation student watched every movement with careful attention. Never tighten a bolt because you are in a hurry, Caleb explained. Tighten it because someone will trust their life to it. The young student nodded seriously. How do you know when it is right? Caleb smiled. When your conscience becomes quieter than your wrench. Madeline stood silently several feet away, listening. Without interrupting, she realized he was teaching the same lesson he practiced every day. The airplane was only the excuse. Character was the real craft. When the lesson ended, the student thanked Caleb and hurried away carrying a notebook filled with careful sketches. Madeline stepped forward. I found the old inspection reports. Caleb simply nodded. I thought you might. You knew they ignored your recommendation. Yes. Why did you stay? He gently wiped his hands with a clean cloth before answering. Because the next family boarding that airplane did not deserve my disappointment. The words struck her more deeply than she expected. She had spent years measuring success by quarterly reports and market value. Standing beside this quiet mechanic, she was beginning to understand another kind of wealth altogether. As Caleb closed his toolbox, Rosie came running across the ramp after school, waving excitedly with another drawing in her hands. Madeline smiled warmly until she saw the picture. This time the silver falcon was standing beside a young woman with long blonde hair, and beneath them Rosie had carefully written in large, uneven letters, "Some people meet long before they know each other." Neither adult noticed the sentence at first, but the elderly line attendant, watching from across the runway, quietly removed his cap and whispered to himself, "She remembers more than either of them knows." Edit. The following Saturday arrived with gentle autumn sunshine spilling across the airport grounds, soft enough to warm the cool morning air without stealing its crispness. For the first time in years, Madeline came to the airport with no meetings scheduled, no reporters waiting, and no business agenda hidden behind polite conversation. She carried nothing except a small paper bag from a neighborhood bakery and a quiet curiosity she no longer tried to hide. Caleb was helping Rosie tighten the tiny plastic propeller on a model airplane beside an empty picnic table near the training runway. The little girl looked up first and smiled brightly. "Daddy, our friend came back." Caleb stood and returned the same calm smile that had slowly become familiar. "Good morning." Madeline held out the bakery bag toward Rosie. "I hope blueberry muffins are acceptable." Rosie looked at her father before accepting it. Caleb nodded gently. "What do we say?" "Thank you." Rosie beamed before opening the bag and laughing with delight. The simple moment carried none of the formality that usually surrounded Madeline's life. They sat together beneath the shade of a broad oak tree while small training airplanes lifted into the clear blue sky one after another, each takeoff marked by the gentle hum of engines climbing toward the clouds. Rosie eagerly showed Madeline her growing collection of airplane drawings, explaining every tiny detail with the seriousness only children possess. There were smiling pilots, bright sunsets, fluffy clouds, and always the same silver falcon somewhere hidden inside each picture. Madeline noticed that every drawing included one more detail. The airplanes always carried families instead of passengers. "Why do you always draw families?" she asked softly. Rosie answered without hesitation. "Daddy says airplanes are happiest when they bring people home." Madeline glanced toward Caleb, who was quietly repairing a loose wheel on the model airplane. "Did you really tell her that?" He smiled without looking up. "Every machine has a purpose. I like her to remember the people before the equipment." The words lingered in Madeline's thoughts. For years, she had built an aviation company by focusing on aircraft performance, market expansion, and shareholder confidence. Sitting beside Caleb and Rosie, She realized she had spent very little time thinking about the quiet reunions happening inside every cabin after every safe landing. As the morning passed, Rosie suddenly reached into her backpack and carefully removed a small wooden box decorated with hand-painted clouds. "Daddy keeps special things here," she whispered proudly. Caleb looked up. "Rosie." She smiled innocently. "Can I show her?" He hesitated before nodding once. Inside the box rested a few treasured keepsakes. A faded family photograph, Rosie's first baby shoe, a tiny silver toy airplane with chipped paint, and beneath them lay the worn silver challenge coin, engraved with the soaring falcon. Madeline stared at it in silence. "May I?" Caleb handed her the coin. She turned it over slowly until her eyes stopped on several tiny engraved initials nearly hidden by years of wear. "M.H." Her breath caught. "Those are my initials." Caleb quietly nodded. "Yes." She looked at him in confusion. "How is that possible?" He rested his hands on the picnic table before answering. "Because it never belonged to me." Before she could ask another question, the elderly line attendant approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. He smiled kindly as he looked at the coin resting in Madeline's hands. I wondered how long it would take before that found its way back to its owner. Complete silence settled beneath the old oak tree. Even Rosie stopped smiling as she looked from one adult to the other. The old attendant took a slow breath before speaking again. "Miss Hayes, 6 years ago during that storm, there was one frightened little girl visiting the airport with her father. She dropped that coin while everyone was rushing for shelter." Caleb picked it up, but by the time he finished helping inspect the damaged aircraft, you were already gone. He carried it ever since because he hoped one day the right owner would come back. Madeline held the weathered silver coin with both hands, as though it had suddenly become far more valuable than the company she had spent years building. She slowly traced the worn initials with her thumb before looking back at Caleb. "You carried this for 6 years?" Caleb nodded gently. "I thought someday someone would come looking for it." She smiled through quiet emotion. "Most people would have forgotten." He looked toward Rosie, who was carefully launching her little model airplane across the grass. Children remember kindness long after adults remember success. The old line attendant smiled knowingly before excusing himself, leaving the 3 of them alone beneath the oak tree. For several moments no one spoke. The wind carried the distant sound of another aircraft climbing into the bright afternoon sky, while fallen leaves drifted lazily across the picnic area. Finally, Madeline placed the coin back into Caleb's hand. "I think you should keep it." Caleb looked surprised. "It belongs to you." She gently shook her head. "It found someone who understood its value better than I ever did." Weeks passed quietly after that afternoon. Madeline began visiting the airport whenever her schedule allowed, never announcing her arrival and never expecting special treatment. Sometimes she simply brought coffee for the mechanics before sunrise. Other days she sat with Rosie, coloring airplanes while Caleb finished inspections nearby. The employees slowly noticed something unusual. Their chief executive smiled more often. She listened before speaking. She even learned the names of janitors, line workers, dispatchers, and mechanics whose faces she had walked past for years without noticing. Then one crisp November morning, the entire company gathered inside the main maintenance hangar for what everyone assumed would be another executive announcement. Instead of standing behind a polished podium, Madeline walked onto the hangar floor beside Caleb. "Today," she said calmly, "we are creating a new position, Director of Flight Safety and Maintenance Integrity." Quiet whispers filled the room. She turned toward Caleb. "I would be honored if you accepted." Every eye settled on him. Caleb looked around the hangar, then smiled politely. "Thank you, but I cannot." Complete silence followed. Madeline blinked in surprise. "May I ask why?" Caleb glanced toward Rosie, who stood proudly beside Walter Benson near the front row. "Because my dream was never to manage mechanics." He reached into his work bag and carefully removed a folded set of blueprints that had been protected inside a clear sleeve for years. Across the top, in faded lettering, were the words Turner Community Aviation Academy. "My wife and I designed this together before she passed away," he said quietly. "A place where children who could never afford flight school could learn aviation, engineering, and honesty together." The room remained perfectly still. Madeline slowly unfolded the plans across a nearby workbench. Every page had been carefully drawn by hand. Classrooms, workshops, scholarship programs, family spaces, even a small art Room where children could draw airplanes, just as Rosie always had. Caleb smiled softly. I never had the money to build it. Madeline looked at the drawings for a long moment before quietly closing the folder. Then let us build it together. Tears shimmered in more than one pair of eyes throughout the hangar. 6 months later, construction began on the academy. Children from every background walked through its doors carrying notebooks, dreams, and endless questions. Rosie proudly hung her silver falcon drawings across the entrance hallway. On opening day, a bronze plaque welcomed every visitor. It did not mention billion-dollar companies, emergency repairs, or expensive airplanes. It simply read, "Integrity is the smallest part you cannot afford to ignore." As the ceremony ended, the elderly line attendant quietly handed Caleb one final envelope that had been discovered inside the oldest company archive. Inside was a letter written by Caleb's late wife the week before she passed away. At the bottom, she had written one final sentence. "If our academy is ever built, it will begin with one small act of honesty that no one thinks matters." Caleb looked toward the runway where a jet lifted gracefully into the evening sky, then toward Madeline and Rosie standing together beneath the silver falcon emblem. And for the first time, he understood that the $888 repair had never been the miracle at all. It had only been the first page of a story that someone else had quietly written years before.